I would like to move on with the next presentation. We will come back to the public to take comments after the next presentation. I appreciate everyone's patience. As I said, I know this is a very important topic to many. So with that, I'd like to introduce Shiprotan Balnick, and we also have Kevin Klein from HR&A. Welcome, gentlemen, and they will be presenting the draft economic analysis.
Great. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can, Shiprotan. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Great. So again, my name is Shiprotan Balnick. I'm a partner at HR&A Advisors. Kevin, if you can just move to the next slide really quickly. And we wanted to share some of our key findings from the economic study we did on the impacts of various different options for the ongoing operations at the airport. Before we do that, just a little quick introduction. HR&A is an economic development and a consulting firm. We have been in business for more than 40 years. And both Kevin and I work out of the New York office. And again, as I said, I'm the partner in charge of this engagement, and Kevin is a senior analyst who is going to speak momentarily. And Kevin has done most of the analytical work that he will take you through. Next slide, Kevin. Just really quickly to familiarize yourselves with who we are. I think a couple of points to sort of for you to sort of keep in mind. One is we do a lot of work in Long Island, in both Nassau and Suffolk, are very, very familiar with sort of the economic and the demographic conditions in the towns and counties in Long Island. Of note, just last year, with the onset of the pandemic, we did a study for both the counties on the COVID impacts, COVID economic impacts. We also have a very specific expertise in doing economic impact studies. And in particular, we have done them both in Long Island, looking at, for example, the impacts of the third track on the main line for the LIRR on a regional basis, as well as doing economic impacts for very specific transportation type projects, such as the expansion of LAX, the closure of Santa Monica Airport, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of a quick introduction about sort of HR&A, the firm, and our practice. I'll spend the next few slides just kind of setting this up before handing it over to Kevin. So Kevin, if you could go to the next slide. And I know Bill has set this up really well, but we were sort of looking at sort of three different options of what the airport potentially might look like in the future. One is sort of the existing airport operations, for which, as Kevin will describe, we looked at sort of 2019 sort of data to understand what those economic impacts might look like. We then looked at the other end of the scale to a scenario which we are calling the alternative passive use scenario, which is about if the airport were to close completely and not be used as an airport and turned over to sort of a passive scenario with hiking trails and parks and open space. What would the impacts look like under that scenario? And then in the middle, we constructed as an option a modified airport scenario with no commercial operations to understand what those impacts are going to be, which is what we are. Kevin is going to describe to you as we go through this presentation. So just to kind of familiarize myself, and I know all of you, and by this time probably know some of the facts very much. It's 610 acres of land, 11,000 arriving passenger operations in 2019. Nearly 2/3 of those passenger operations happened during the summer season. 60%, 3/5 of HTO passengers stay in East Hampton. And from data that we have compiled from various sources, we estimate that less than 1% of the 1.7 million visitors to East Hampton actually use the airport for transportation purposes. Just to step back, the airport, as you may all know, is completely self-funded. The annual budget, the 2020 budget for the airport is $6 million, and that is essentially sort of recouped from revenues in terms of landing fees and aviation fuel and things of that sort. Just to step back, and this is some important context as we think about the impacts from the airport, and put it in the context of the overall sort of economy of the town of East Hampton. The tourism employment in the town of East Hampton is about 25%. About 1 in 4 jobs are tourism-oriented jobs. The town as a whole has about 12,000 jobs, so about 3,000 of those jobs are in tourism-type industries. Over half of the housing units are for seasonal use. Nearly 50% of the taxable sales in East Hampton come from tourists and second homeowners. And the town, like other towns in Long Island, a little over 50% of the town's operating revenues derive from property taxes. So something for you to sort of keep in mind as benchmarks over here as we sort of get into the specifics about what the economic impacts are for each of these scenarios. And as we talk about the economic impacts and sort of present them in terms of the absolute number of jobs, we will also sort of put them in the context of what is it as a percentage of total jobs, or what is it as a percentage of tourism jobs in the East Hampton economy. So just to quickly sort of describe the 3 scenarios. So for the existing conditions, which is the typical sort of pre-COVID 2019 operations, as well as the modified operations, which we are describing as the elimination of all commercial flights. What we did was we used an econometric model called Implant, which is sort of nationally recognized. It was customized for just the town of East Hampton. So all the economic impacts that we are going to describe are for the town of East Hampton only. So for those 2 initial scenarios, existing conditions, modified operations, we actually went ahead and used this econometric model Implant to evaluate the economic impacts. To evaluate the economic impact of the passive use, which assumes that all airport operations are closed, both commercial and non-commercial, and the 600 acres is essentially repurposed as passive open space, again, parks, trails, things of that sort. HRNA did a more qualitative analysis to understand, what are the potential sort of, benefits that might come to both East Hampton residents and visitors from the passive use. And to do this qualitative analysis, we did a pretty extensive literature review to understand from precedent cases what some of those qualitative benefits might look like. So at this point in time, I'm going to hand this over to Kevin Klein to take you all through the actual benefits of each of these 3 scenarios one by one.
Great. Thanks, Super Team. So starting off with the existing condition scenario, for this, we are assuming typical pre-COVID, and that means 2019 operations, looking at data from 2019. And for that, we needed to gather some inputs for our model. So for that, we looked at both airport operations, which we would consider spending by the airport, as well as spending by passengers who use the airport, to come up with our sort of total East Hampton Airport economic impact figure. For airport operations, we looked at the town budget to look at how that $6.3 million was spent in 2019, and sort of distributed that among the day-to-day functions of the airport: labor costs, professional services, and fuel. For the passenger spending piece of this, we looked at the activity created by visitors who travel to the town via the airport. And those are both passengers arriving via both commercial and non-commercial aircraft. We'll get into a little bit more on how that spending is sort of distributed among the town. And with those two inputs, we use our economic impact model to come up with the total figure for the impact of East Hampton Airport. What we do know, however, is that not all of the passengers who use East Hampton Airport end up ultimately traveling to the town of East Hampton. We worked with the transportation firm INRIX to do an analysis of anonymized geolocated cell phone data to sort of look at where passengers who fly into East Hampton Airport, where do they ultimately go? And using that, we sort of aggregated this data to points of interest and found that about only 60% of East Hampton Airport passengers then proceed into the town of East Hampton. So if we're looking at our annual 24,000 arriving passengers figure, we would discount that by about 10,000 passengers who we know are traveling to either Southampton or other points west, bring us to a total of 14,000 total East Hampton bound arriving passengers in 2019. We also know that airport passengers are likely to spend more per trip than other visitors. We come up with an estimate of around $500 to $1,300 per visitor per visit. And then you'll see, based on data from the RKG Associate study of East Hampton Hamlet Business District Town Plan, we can see that spending is distributed among 5 major categories: residential maintenance, recreation and entertainment, general retail, accommodations, and the bulk spent on food and beverages. And using those figures and extrapolating to all airport visitors, we estimate that East Hampton Airport visitors' estimated spending represents about only 1 to 3% of the town's total taxable sales. That's, I think, $7 to $20 million. And combine that with the airport operations figure earlier, I mentioned the fuel, the professional services, the labor costs, to use those as inputs into our model, and found that I think only around, 100 to 230 jobs are supported by the East Hampton Airport, as well as $13 million to $26 million in local spending. That 100 to 230 jobs accounts for about 1 to 2% of all East Hampton employment, or I think 8% of tourism employment. Moving on to the modified operation scenario, this was assuming the elimination of all commercial flights. So just defining that a little bit quickly for you here. Commercial flights would consist of aircraft for hire to transport passengers. Those are scheduled flights, chartered flights, or commuter helicopters, while non-commercial aircraft are mostly small personal aircrafts. For this, we've discounted any aircraft that might be used for instructional or practice flights. Those are aircraft that are both taking off and landing from East Hampton Airport. A majority of passengers, about 3/4, fly into East Hampton via commercial aircraft, leaving only around 6,000 arriving non-commercial passengers in 2019. If we're applying the sort of same discount for passengers who don't continue on to the town of East Hampton, those who travel to Southampton or other points west, that leaves us with around 4,000 East Hampton bound non-commercial passengers. And applying our sort of same visitor spending distribution methodology from earlier, that's about $2 to $5 million in non-commercial passenger spending. We also know from a study that we conducted in 2019, we did a ground survey of passengers, asking a variety of questions about where these passengers are going, how they would change their behaviors if the airport were closed. And around 48% of those passengers suggested that if the airport were closed, they would continue to visit their destinations via another mode of transportation like car or rail. So knowing that if the airport were closed, around 48% of visitors would continue to visit East Hampton, we were able to add back in those visits to come up with the total potential spending loss from travelers that will not come back, being around $3 to $7 million. Combining that with the airport operations figure and passenger spending effects, this comes out to around 65 to 150 jobs supported by the modified scenario, as well as 10 million to 18 million in local spending. moving on to the passive use scenario, as Super Team suggested earlier, this was a more qualitative analysis sort of different benefits of parks and open space. We analyzed both the economic benefits, community benefits, and environmental impacts, knowing that parks and open space have impacts on property value, spending, community benefits such as reduction of noise, quality of life improvements, physical health, as well as environmental benefits like water quality and stormwater management, reduction of pollution, and so on. So different parks and open space resources have a variety of benefits, as I mentioned earlier, including real estate values. Different parks have different values depending on the typology of park. Not all parks are the same. You can have more of like a woodland park, a major destination park like Central Park, things that are either really activated with events and programming, or one that's just mainly trails. We've sort of outlined the variety of benefits of those different types of parks here. You can see that a lot of neighborhood parks have both real estate and environmental benefits, while parks with unique assets like events or programming are bringing a lot of tourism and local spending. We know from a literature review that major parks create a real estate premium for properties around the park. We looked at Central Park, which we know famously doubled property values around the park within 15 years. Condo resale prices along the Toronto waterfront resulted in a 5% premium over an 8-year period. Trail networks such as greenways, bicycle trails also have been observed to have real estate benefits. The Caddy Trail in Dallas, Texas increased property values around 25% within 7 years. Austin, Texas saw a 12% premium and home value increases along the Barton Creek Greenbelt within 2 years. And even natural areas, those that aren't truly improved, still have benefits to local residents, to local real estate values. A study in Portland, Oregon found that homes within 1,500 feet of a natural area park raised the home value by around 1%. The airport also creates environmental and quality of life impacts. As we know, from noise pollution to groundwater contamination, there have been many noise complaints against the airport for disrupting the quiet and rural environment. We know that East Hampton's unique attributes make it vulnerable to effects of pollution from airport-related water contamination. And we know that ground pollution from East Hampton Airport has affected nearby drinking water, resulting in contamination. We put this all together in a sort of table here to organize the different outputs. You can see them stacked up against each other. I'll leave this up for a little bit to let anyone take a look. But I think moving on from this, we have some high-level takeaways next, and we can move on to questions. So for key takeaways, the current airport operations and passenger spending generates around 13 million to 26 million in economic output, and around 100 to 230 full-time jobs. As I mentioned earlier, that's around 1 to 2% of the town's taxable sales. The employment at the airport, the employment impact of the airport is around 100 to 230 jobs. That's 1 to 2% of all East Hampton employment. The net employment impact of the modified scenario, that's subtracting the commercial aircraft, is around 0.5 to 1.3% of all East Hampton employment, and 2 to 5% of tourism employment, as well as noting that complete closure of East Hampton Airport will result in benefits that improve the town residents' quality of life, reduce noise, ground and water pollution, and some of these benefits may have positive impacts on nearby property values.